Hello, here we go again. 90-day Bible study. This is day 8. We're in Leviticus, 1st chapter, 1st verse, through the 14th chapter and the 32nd verse. Tony Wright again, First Love Christian Church, FLCC, and AB Wright Ministries. Okay, first I need to point out something. If you've reviewed the last thing, the most recent thing that I posted, it's labeled day 6. But if you viewed that, you probably noticed that it was actually day 6 and 7 material that was included in that posting. Well, I can't go back and change the label now. My bad. But the info is there, right? And now, if there's anything that I did miss and you want to comment on it, just hit us up on one of the social media platforms or shoot me an email. You can send it to flcc@flcc-rock hill. I guess I probably need to start adding that to the banner information. Anyway, hopefully though, one of the takeaways you've had from everything that we've covered in Genesis and Exodus was that every person, regardless of their role in the narrative, every person, they had some kind of issue. Now, I tried to point that out as best I could and highlight it as we went, not to demean them or anything in any way at all, but to give us hope in every single way. The way I view it, if God can use them with all their flaws and shortcomings, then surely God can use me too with all of mine. We should have also noticed, though, that from the time that Adam and Eve displayed their little act of disobedience in the garden, God had put in place a plan to redeem man and restore that broken relationship that resulted from their disobedience. Now, the Bible told us, I'm sorry, somebody needs to say Bible. Yeah, Bible. The Bible says that man had become so wicked that God wiped them out with the great flood. Only ones left? Noah and his family. And up through day 7, God had worked, though, through various chosen vessels with every flaw they had, every shortcoming, every wart that they had. God continued to do that, just work through those chosen vessels. And at the same time, though, God was working to establish a nation from these Hebrews. Now, through that nation, God would eventually send to all of mankind a vessel of redemption. Boy, I feel better about a second. Now, by the end of the book of Exodus, right there near the end of it, God had given instructions for building the tabernacle. Now, here we are entering into Leviticus, where the people are going to receive instructions and regulations for how they worship there in that temple and how they conduct themselves every day of their life amongst the people that they're around. So God had rescued his people from Egypt with this mighty act of grace that they didn't earn, rescue, they didn't deserve it. Heck, at times they didn't even seem to want their freedom. But now God's goodness to them is going to be fully shared and shown to the whole world. Leviticus teaches us holiness is for everyone. So many of the other religions, they had a single individual or position that everybody went to ask for intervention or access to whatever their object of worship happened to be. God addressed for his people in this book of Leviticus. He started to lay that out and address all the multifaceted components of their human life. God addressed everything. He didn't leave anything. He addressed everything from the Sabbath to sex, from murder to menstruation. He touched on it all. If you read through that, you see he didn't miss anything. God showed his people that holiness extends to all God's people, not just the priests or pastors, as we like to think of it, and not just the church, but to every place in life, not just to the temple or tabernacle. Boy, do we need to remember that. Like when we're talking smack about our pastors, or when we walk out of this, hot service, all holy, and then we go down to the restaurant and curse out the server while we're wolfing down that after church chicken. Hoo-wee. Everyone that belongs to God is called to be holy in every way. I like to think of Leviticus as this time when God works through a people to establish his earthly throne among this body of people. So Leviticus shows us in no uncertain terms that Israel is to be God's holy people. and they were to worship him in a holy way. You know, God is holy, and every aspect of the life of his people must reflect his holiness. Help me, somebody. I don't think I need to say that again. God's holy, and every aspect of the life of his people must reflect his holiness. Are you reflecting holiness today? I'm just asking. Now, many aspects of Israelites' practices, though, would seem to mirror similar practices being conducted by other nations of people around them. But God, man, here we go again. But God redeemed from those practices what was necessary. And what was necessary was for their practices to be conducted with purity and with honor and with holiness. You just didn't come before God any old kind of way. God banned idols. He banned culture, sexuality. He banned polytheistic worship, or the worship of many gods. In fact, for many years, it was Israel's worship of one God, that monotheistic worship, that made them stand out, that separated them from other nations and separated their practices from the practices of other nations. The name Leviticus comes, though, from the first word of the same book, this same book, in the Hebrew Bible, where it really literally means, and he called. And this references the Lord calling Moses to give him these instructions. Of course, Leviticus, the name, is also connected to the Levite tribe, or the tribe of Levi, that tribe that was set aside to be priests. Anyway, led by Moses, these descendants of Abraham, of Isaac, and of Jacob, they journeyed across the desert to Mount Sinai. And here God is going to make a covenant with them and give them his law. And it's here that Moses is given further instructions on how these people can maintain that unique relationship with God. It's also here at Mount Sinai where God gave Israel this special identity and the role in the world, right? So namely, they are to be this priestly people, and they are to be a holy nation. The verses in today's reading, though, represents most of what's considered to be the first half of Leviticus. Leviticus is normally considered to be, as you read through it, divided into two sections. So this section deals mainly, though, with priestly task of sacrifice and getting right with God. And these laws and regulations that God was introducing to the people were to transforming them into a nation of God's people who were to operate under his holiness code. All right? Israel is to be holy. And this holiness is not voluntary. It's a command. It's spelled out in many of the regulations in a straightforward way. And by its wording, and then the stark consequences that he lays out for disobedience of those laws. God's love is tough, as it's shown in these verses. But if Israel is continue that freedom, they have to understand the reality and the danger of sin. Anything that undermines that relationship with God has to be dealt with, and dealt with vigorously. And God's going to do that. Now, the book of Leviticus begins with how to make sacrifices. It provides that manual for all kinds of ritual for the time when Jews later would have a temple in Jerusalem. So they needed to get themselves right with God. Now they needed to get in shape, get comfortable with serving God the way that he has ordained it to be now, before they go in and occupy their promised land and set up their temples of worship. God is teaching them how to worship him. That's powerful, isn't it? If we really know how to worship God, that's all I can say. Now, we first saw sacrifice when Cain brought his produce, and Abel offered the animal in their sacrifice to God. And later we saw where Noah burned a whole animal on the altar after he came out of the ark. But it was the reasons for Israel's sacrifices that clearly separated them from these pagan practices. In Israel, the sacrifice was for the benefit of the ordinary or common person that brought it in. And for that sacrifice, they were to receive, and did receive, words of forgiveness. So it was about forgiveness. There weren't any wild fertility rites, and they didn't have to try to make contact with the dead. They didn't have to pray to ancestors, and there weren't any, magic spells and fortune telling. They didn't have to slice a hut, cut themselves up, trying to prove their remorse to God. None of that. They just had to bring in their offering and submit it to God. Now, the burnt offering was to either be a bullock or a sheep or a goat, and to be a perfect or unblemished male animal. For poor individuals, though, they didn't have to have one of these. They could bring in a dove or a young pigeon. And then you saw mention of a fellowship offering. And that was a sacrifice that was to be a shared meal. And it was to express a joyful unity of life between God and his people and between worshipers themselves. So that was the fellowship offering. You also saw mention of a grain offering that was to be made of fine flour, and they were to make that into a cake with oil and incense, and the ingredients used, though, help it to burn, and they give off a fragrant smell, and the smell of sacrifices was thought of as reaching God and pleasing him. It was to be a reminder that God's anger with sin was being taken out on the sacrifice. The grain offering was to be mixed with salt too, and that was a preservative. It's a token of friendship. But if you can imagine, in an area where there are a lot of animals being killed constantly, if you've been around a slaughterhouse, if you've even been around dead animals, that's not the most pleasant aroma. So many of these incense and oils were to help alleviate some of that. God was thinking of his people. But in these grain offerings and friendship offerings, often the leftovers from that went to the priest, and that was in part to help as a wage, or something provided to him for his upkeep as he took care of that, helping to keep that relationship with God solidified for him and his people. The offering you saw mentioned was the sin offering, and it was to provide for unintentional wrongdoing. Some of those sins were committed through ignorance, and property or people got damaged by accident, but there was still guilt. So this kind of sin was what was described as missing the mark, and you'll see examples of that. And it could have been anything, range from touching unclean things, or withholding information. It could have been any kind of thing. Another offering that we saw in there was the guilt offering, and that was where you had a strong sense of trying to repair damage between God and people, and it usually required some substantial or expensive sacrifice to emphasize the person's fault for what had happened. All right, and this offense was one that hurt both God and man, or human beings. So the sacrifice was designed to mend or make good those relationships. Now, out of these blood sacrifices, it should provide today's believer with a strong image of the seriousness of sin and the cost of salvation. And it should teach us as Christians about the holiness of God and about the everyday life of the believer and what we should be about. So in this book of Leviticus, the Christian find and should see many pointers to Jesus, because to be sure, he is that perfect high priest and sacrifice. Another thing I wanted to point out, remember Aaron's sons, Nadab and Abihu, and their little censers they put fire in and added incense, and then they offered unauthorized fire before the Lord contrary to his command. Didn't go very well for them, did it? Now, priests were supposed to prevent the common from coming into contact with the holy. And something was considered holy when it was associated with God. Everything else was common. A part of everyday life. So when these two sons of Aaron produced their own flame for the burning of incense, holy fire flamed up and consumed them, because they had willfully breached God's command to keep every detail of sacrifice separate from everyday use. And they had to pay with their lives. Aaron's sons should have known better than to confuse holy with common. We should know better than to confuse holy with common. So the task of the blood sacrifice is to make holy something which was common. or to cleanse something which had been polluted. And it was the priest's task to teach people these distinctions so that they could lead a clean life in their everyday life and in everyday circumstances with their families and in their homes and around on their farms. So these laws in Leviticus are a means to that end, to keep them holy in that environment. And their purpose was to enable God to be able to dwell among his people. Remember, God had walked with their ancestors and shown them the way, shown them what to do, and set them as an example among people. But now he was doing that to these people as a nation. And he was going to come and dwell in their presence, unlike with their ancestors where he would convene with them, come to them in a dream, or show them, in some way what they were to do. He was going to dwell here in this earth with his people. And he was setting up this tabernacle environment, this worship environment, for that purpose. Boy, to know that God yet today dwells here among us, and that he used this process to be able to reach down through the generations to get to a point where a rascal like me could have a relationship with him. Hoo-wee! Boy, as you go through Leviticus, look for those connections that point to Christ, that point to our future. A lot of the practices and things that you'll see here have long since been done away with. But what they show you is how serious God was about separating his people out from among the heathen nations and the practices, that the pagan practices that they were constantly involved and engaged in. And you'll see the struggle as we go forward of keeping those people focused on serving him and not reverting to their old common paganistic ways. And to this day, let me stop. You know what to do. Just stay in touch with us on our social media platforms. Keep the reading up. We're almost at the 1/10th mark here. We're getting through this. We're going to make it, brothers and sisters. And you know what to do. Tell your friends. Tell your neighbors. FLCC, we're taking ministry back to our first love. Peace.